Hello, this is the AI Lab. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Paul Keller. Paul is the co-founder and director of policy at the Open Future Foundation, a European non-profit organization. He has extensive experience as a media activist, open policy advocate, and systems architect, striving to improve access to knowledge and culture. The reason? A paper by the Open Future Foundation entitled A Vocabulary for Opting Out of AI Training and Other Forms of TDM. Let's hear what Paul has to say. So, Paul, why did you feel that there was a need to create this vocabulary for opting out of AI training and other forms of text and data mining? And maybe at the same time, you can explain the difference between text and data mining in general and AI.
I'll come to this, but maybe let me go back a little bit. So this is part of our work on trying to make the EU copyright framework work for AI training. And this is something that we've started working on more than 2 years ago. And at the core of this EU copyright framework is, you mentioned it, the TDM exceptions, right? Like the exceptions for text and data mining that were introduced in the 2019 Copyright Directive, and that in theory provide a relatively balanced legal framework for AI training, which is, I think everybody agrees now, a form of text and data mining. And the EU rules essentially say that scientific researchers and cultural heritage organizations can use any publicly available information works to do text and data mining or to train AI models. And everybody else can do that as well. But here, rights holders and creators have the ability to make a reservation and then to say no, essentially, and then maybe go license. And we like this framework because it provides, on the one hand, legal clarity. It's clear, like you are allowed to do this under certain conditions. It privileges public interest users like academic research, but also the preservation of cultural heritage. It ensures that rights holders have some level of control over their works, and it makes sure that the majority of publicly available works are available to innovate on top of, to build new things. So this is good. But just because this is good in theory, it doesn't really mean it works in practice. And so last summer, we published a policy brief that looked at how we can make this work in practice, and that identified 4 issues that need to be solved in order to make this work in practice. And those 4 issues, one among them was the need for a common vocabulary. And the purpose of such a vocabulary is to provide a common language for expressing rights reservations and opt-outs that are understood in the same way along the entire value chain by the creators and other rights holders who make an opt-out, but also by data aggregators, like things like Common Crawl, who bring together data. And then finally, the model developers who work with the data and train models based on them. And so there's currently a lot of confusion in this space with a lot of different systems and approaches. And the vocabulary is essentially an attempt to provide more clarity for everyone involved. So in a sense, you can say we sort of assigned this work to ourselves last year. But maybe more importantly, also to say that this vocabulary proposal is the outcome of discussions that we had with many sort of stakeholders, including rights holders, AI companies, policymakers, academics, and public interest technologists who have experience in building licensing frameworks and so on. So yeah, that's our motivation. This is what brought us to publish this earlier this month. And
Thank you. That's clear, and kudos to you to put so many people around the table to discuss it. That is brave. Now, looking at the vocabulary itself, how do you see it helping all of these different stakeholders you mentioned? Like, the creators, the AI developers, the policymakers. Help them in navigating the challenges of AI training on the one hand and being respectful and mindful of copyright.
So at the very core, the idea of vocabulary is that you have some common understanding of language, right? Like the terms that you use mean the same to other people that you deal with. And that's what we're trying to do. And at the core of the vocabulary is what we call use cases. So it defines a couple of use cases that in this specific context can be used, if you will, to target your opt-outs. So you can say like, I opt out of this use case, but I opt in for another one. And by describing sort of with precision these use cases, we think that it's much easier for people to understand each other. Um, but let me go into some more detail on the use cases that we've defined the vocabulary itself. Like there are three use cases in it, and the first use case that we have, and that is really like the broadest use case, that is a bit our starting point for developing this. It's the already mentioned idea of text and data mining, the concept of text and data mining, and that is actually not something that we needed to define ourselves, because that is something that is defined in the 2019 Copyright Directive, where it defines text and data mining as any computational process that tries to basically gain insights from copyrighted works, which essentially, if you think that through, means that is pretty broad. This is essentially any use that computers make of copyrighted works is text and data mining in the extreme. So you have, if you will, sort of like the ability in the in the copyright directive to opt out from text and data mining unless it's for scientific purposes. And that means you have the ability to opt out from basically computational uses of your works. So you can say like no computer use of this. That is probably not something that very many rights holders actually want to say. They probably have other things in mind that they want to opt out, that they object to, or that they think is something that they should be monetized for. But sort of they probably don't want to make it impossible to interact with their works in the internet, to make them findable, to include them in sort of like ranking algorithms, things like that. So we have this, but sort of we established they have the right under the copyright directive to do this, to opt out. And so we create this overarching, really wide use case of text and data mining. So you can use the vocabulary and say, like, I want to opt out of text and data mining. Um, but as I said, like many people probably don't want to do this. And this whole discussion didn't start at the moment where this idea of the text and data mining exceptions were introduced in 2019, but it comes from this moment in time 2.5 years ago when ChatGPT came along and what people call generative AI came along. And lots of rights holders, lots of creators suddenly got sort of started thinking about, hey, is this something that I'm comfortable with? Is this something that I want to allow? What about my rights? And sort of to some degree, then in the end, you see that there is the text and data mining exception to fall back on. And people say like, oh, we can opt out of text and data mining. But in reality, they want to opt out of something that we call generative AI training in the vocabulary, right? Like they are concerned, we know from lots of conversations, mainly from users of their works to train AI models that then produce content that is similar to their works or that can compete with their works. So this is more like a very targeted concern that arises to this particular form of text and data mining. And so on the other end of our vocabulary, we have the ability, we define this term generative AI. Um, there's lots of questions how you can exactly define that, because it's something that everybody sort of think they know how it works, but actually it's quite complex. I don't think this is the place to go into the details of the precise definition. People can read the vocabulary. But so like we have this very small targeted way of opting out of generative AI training. And we suspect that most people probably want to do this and not necessarily opt out of of text and data mining. And then we have a third category in between, which is AI training. And the AI training category is a little bit broader. So this includes things that are not included in the generative AI category, like classifiers or facial recognition or sort of ranking algorithms, like things. There's a lot of uses of AI that do not necessarily produce sort of synthetic content as output, but that are used in many ways. And they are often also trained on copyrighted works because they need to recognize something or they need to learn certain sort of logical patterns or structures from them. And so from the conversations, it's emerged that there's also a contingent of people who think it's useful to sort of like basically say more broadly no to AI while still allowing other types of TDM. And so we define this, if you will, middle category, which is much more defined because it's really targeted on the AI sort of like approach, training AI models, but it's still wider than just generative AI training. And so you have, if you will, like sort of the Russian dolls with the wide TDM category, that in that is AI training and in that is generative AI training. And we offer these three use cases for people to target their opt-outs from. And the hope is that if people across different systems, from different types of the cultural industries, use these use cases to target their opt-outs while probably very often using different techniques to do that. One could be robots TXT. The other one could be something that is embedded as metadata in an image file. And there is countless other forms of this. But if all of these technologies sort of use the same definition of what they are opting out, it becomes interoperable. And it becomes also relatively simple to understand on the rights holder side. Like you have these three gradations, and also on the AI model developers, you need to take care of three different gradations of what you can or cannot do with these things. So we think that, like, we hope that the system will mainly work through making things interoperable, standardizing them by having common recognizable terms that mean the same to everybody involved in this entire value chain.
Mhm. Considering then how quickly AI is evolving, I mean, there's like a new thing every month, if not every week, coming out, or a new model or a new use case
Mm.
to a certain extent. Well, maybe not a use case in your sense, but new
Yeah.
use of AI. Do you see any limitations to the vocabulary in terms of having to evolve, and are there steps in the future to continue improving the vocabulary to make sure that people keep on understanding each other and talk about the same thing?
I mean, first, it is a proposal for vocabulary, right? Like the biggest limitation is probably at the moment that we published this 2 weeks ago, and like we need to see if this lands in reality, and if organizations, if stakeholders start working with this, right? Like our operating assumption here is that there is a number of organizations who are in charge of these sort of like opt-out services. So they are, if you will, information intermediaries in between organizations like Spawning, or there's this TDM rep working group, or there is a thing called TDM AI. But there's also big companies like Adobe who steward this CP2A standard. So like these information intermediaries, if they start working this, um, because they essentially convey the information from rights holders to model providers, then it has a chance to become something that structures this field. And if that happens, you're right, there's still limitations, right? Like one of the things that emerged, I think, during the time span that we were working on this vocabulary is this issue of sort of AI powered search or inference or retrieval or augmented generation, which is essentially when trained AI models make use of information or works that they find online in order to produce the output. So it's not used for training the model is already trained, but then the model uses something as input. We refer to that in the vocabulary as sort of an inference use case that we don't define yet. So we have, if you will, a placeholder. So at the moment, that is something. Should the vocabulary be taken up, I'm pretty sure that we will need to have a discussion also how the vocabulary deals with this particular form. And again, this is something that came up during the last year. And as you point out, this is very, very fast moving. So I'd be surprised if there's not other scenarios that we don't see at the moment that will come up in relatively short time. But it is designed as a sort of very simple, relatively flexible approach to that makes it expandable.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I think that gives a good overview of why we need a translator between rights holders and model developers. Maybe you can build it as an AI language model, the vocabulary, and let's hope that people look at it as you said, and that there is an uptake. That means that your work comes to fruition. Thank you so much for your input.
Yeah, thanks for having us.